Welcome back, I'm Imran Garda. Europe's border-free Schengen zone now covers an area of some 3.6 million square kilometres. The scrapping of border controls will affect some 400 million people. Just what are the main concerns raised by sceptics of the enlargement of the Schengen zone? Well, first, there are growing fears of a rise in illegal immigration, human trafficking and organised crime. Many inside Europe also fear a borderless continent would give so-called terrorists the freedom to move easily. Then there are concerns of an influx of poorer Europeans into wealthy countries like France and Germany. That would put huge strain on the budget of these countries, as they are obliged under EU laws to provide newcomers with a social security umbrella. Relations with Russia is also a main concern, especially on the missile shield issue and other defence issues. If cornered, Moscow could retaliate using its new arm, gas supplies. Well, joining us again are our guests in Brussels, Valdez Dombrovski, in Warsaw, Ilkka Laitinen, and in London, Mats Persson. Mr. Laitinen, let's go bit by bit into these concerns throughout the second half. Is the fear of some Western Europeans that their countries will now be swamped by an influx of undeserving neighbours from the East justified?
Well, I think that the concerns are rather unjustified because of the fact that even though the internal border checks will be lifted, there are a series of flanking and compensatory measures at our disposals. First of all, I would like to mention the enhanced and more effective control at the external borders, enhanced police cooperation, use of joint databases like the Schengen information system. And all the member states, I mean the old Schengen countries and the new one, they are fully prepared to perform these duties by using the new instruments at their disposal.
Well, although you might feel that the fears are unjustified, they are there and they seem to be quite real. A poll recently suggested that over 60% of Germans believe open borders are an invitation to crime. So it is there, Mr. Laitinen.
It's a big challenge for the law enforcement and also to the countries involved to fill in this gap which is caused by the lifting of the border controls. But really, as I mentioned before, the law enforcement in all the member states, they are fully prepared for performing their duties by using new modi operandi.
Mats Persson, when looking at those who are not Schengen members, some have called this the creation of a new Iron Curtain. Is there any substance to that?
That's quite dramatic. Don't know if there's much substance to that per se, but I think that in terms of the countries that are not members of the Schengen, I think there's a real nervousness about letting go of such an important issue such as immigration. I mean, this is something that people do feel nervous about. It's not something that we should deny. I mean, there are a lot of benefits to open borders, but when governments are faced with an electorate that are increasingly feeling anxious about levels of immigration, I think we need to take that into account at least. And I think the countries that are not members of the Schengen currently, you know, we should take their concerns seriously.
Yeah, looking at their concerns, Mr. Dombrovski in Brussels, it's hardly likely that the Ukraine and Belarus will join anytime soon, and they are effectively cut off from their neighbours. Many of them can't even afford the Schengen visa fees. How seriously is the European Union looking at these issues?
Well, first of all, let's understand that Schengen is mainly EU internal policy. And some countries which joined Schengen or some aspects of Schengen are more to be seen as an exception than as a rule. So clearly Belarus or Ukraine, which are not EU member states, also are not part of Schengen. But if we look at the citizens of those countries, certainly there are some benefits which also comes from Schengen. For example, before Schengen, if a Belarus citizen would come over to Latvia, it would come over with Latvia's visa. And it would have problems, for example, to go to Estonia, which is another country, and would request another visa from Belarus citizen. Now, once he gets a Schengen visa and enters Latvia, he can go to Estonia or to Portugal or to wherever he wants in the EU.
But Mr. Dombrovskis, sorry to interrupt you. I think one of the concerns is that people from those places and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, which is wedged between Poland and Lithuania, have said that they are suffering adversely because they struggle to get that visa in the first place. So they understand that they can have a lot if they do get it, but they're not getting it.
Certainly Schengen visa system implies certain checks and certain procedures to get this visa. But previously also, for example, citizens of Belarus or Ukraine were still had to obtain Latvian visa. And it also was, certain hurdle for those citizens. So I don't see much of a disadvantage if they get now Latvian visa, which is, by the way, also Schengen visa, which is even better.
Mr. Persson in London, you touched upon this a little bit earlier on, illegal immigration. Is it going to be a bigger problem for Europe now?
A bigger problem? I'm not so sure. I mean, there will be problems with trying to agree a more common immigration policy. I mean, we've seen a lot of disagreements among the member states of the EU and the Schengen as to how a common immigration policy should look like. And I think there are issues here. For example, in terms of a single asylum system governing, for example, which countries the EU should accept asylum applications from, and also such things as whether asylum seekers should be allowed to work in the member states while awaiting a decision. And I think these are issues that will be very, very hard for the EU 27 and the Schengen states. I mean, this is obviously interrelated. It will be very hard for them to agree upon.
Mr. Leitonen, should there be exactly the same type of freedom for non-EU passport holders who are maybe traveling within Schengen countries on a visit visa? Do you think they should have the same type of freedom that passport holders have?
Well, actually, if I may come back to the issue of the illegal migration and the enlargement of the Schengen area, I think all these concerns should be taken seriously, because free movement within the Schengen space is a pull factor as such. So all the law enforcement of all the member states and also our colleagues in third countries should really work harder together and create a common situational picture to really target the law enforcement measures in an appropriate way. But I would like to also turn back to the issue about the Schengen visa procedures and the new situation and in the certain stretches of the borders. We do have a good example at the Schengen external borders, where there has been a visa regime in place for a rather long time, and where the cross-border traffic works fluently. I have to mention the border between Finland and the Russian Federation. And we can see the figures at that stretch of borders, which are increasing all the time. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the Schengen system, when it's in force, would hamper fluent border crossings for legitimate and bona fide travelers.
Valdez Dombrovskis, it's obvious that Western Europe is a lot more lucrative for anybody when it comes to business, to livelihoods. Won't Eastern Europe lose all its best brains, all its most talented people to the West?
Well, this certainly is a cause of concern. And also in Latvia, quite a few people have left it, but it's relatively little to do with Schengen. It has actually more to do with EU policy of free movement of labor. And as more and more old EU member states are opening up to the labor from new member states, we certainly see that part of the people use this opportunity, and actually they would go to the old member states. For example, from Latvia, which is a relatively small country with 2.3 million population, well, several tens of thousands of people have left, mainly to UK and Ireland. And certainly it is a cause of concern also in Latvia, and it's having its adverse consequences.
Mats Persson, do you agree that the brain drain is not necessarily a Schengen issue?
Actually, I do agree with that. I don't think it is a Schengen issue. If you look at the migration trends to the UK, which again the UK is not the part of the Schengen, you see that it's to a large extent Central and Eastern Europeans that have come here and sort of left a little bit of vacuum in their home countries. We hear reports from Poland, for example, where there's a lack of workers in sectors such as electricity, plumbing, carpentry, etc. So and also skilled workers or workers with a certain degree or certain expertise. So I mean, the brain drain, I would say, is not a Schengen issue necessarily, but it obviously could be potentially exacerbated by the Schengen, the extension of the Schengen.
Ilkka Laitinen, with the new Schengen member states and with NATO expanding right up to Russia's doorstep, some would say, do you think that these issues will create a more chilly atmosphere between Russia and many of the Western nations?
Well, actually, if we really take a look to the law enforcement and border control cooperation with our colleagues in the Russian Federation, we do have a lot of good examples of a fluent cooperation at this field. For instance, the member states which are neighboring Russian Federation, the cooperation runs fluently, and also Frontex agency, the European Union Border Security Agency, we have had this bilateral agreement with the Border Guard Service of Russian Federation for about 2 years, and we really consider ourselves to be at the same side of the border whilst leaving the criminals at the opposite side of the border. So that is one of the key features why by using what we are able to bridge the security gap, which is one of the consequences of lifting the border checks at internal borders.
Valdis Dombrovskis, do you concur that there's no further polarization between Western and Central European nations and Russia with Schengen?
Well, certainly not, because first of all, NATO enlargement was taking place several years ago, and it's absolutely nothing to do with Schengen. And as regards Schengen, it's really first and foremost EU internal policy. And I don't think somebody should be much concerned if people from one EU country can move to another EU country more freely. I don't really see here anything to be concerned for any third country nationals.
Mats Persson, let's look at this a little bit more philosophically and maybe on a broader scale. This trend of open borders, do you think that this is something that can maybe be replicated in other continents, in other areas like Asia, the Middle East, Africa?
Well, I think it's easy when we talk about the EU's open borders, etc., to get bogged down into small details. Of course, we have to admit and acknowledge the scale of this and what an accomplishment it is, after all, to have open borders, to have a free Europe. Although we here would have issues with the way EU is evolving, we still think it's a very great thing. I mean, I would be very careful to project the EU as a model on the rest of the world. I think that's a mistake that has been done often in the past. But I mean, of course, it's always better when people openly and freely trade and move, as opposed to when there's a conflict. And in Asia, we see certain tendencies where you have at least much more trade going on. And if that can be translated into free movement of people, yes, maybe. And hopefully, at least in terms of having rather open borders, I think that would generally be a very good thing. So hopefully.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your thoughts. We've reached the end of the program. In Brussels, Valdis Dombrovskis, Latvia's former Minister of Finance and member of the European Parliament. In Warsaw, Ilkka Laitinen, the Executive Director of Frontex. And in London, Mats Persson, a researcher at Open Europe. It's been fascinating hearing your thoughts, and it's an issue that won't go away very soon. I'm sure we'll have many more programs on this. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. There's that address on your screen. Bye-bye for now. See you soon.